Spanish maid, Caribbean man, sunshine in the rain. Caribbean man, I put the guy in innovation. Caribbean man, Trinidad of inception. Caribbean man, I sing in Mali, I sing in Kings. Caribbean man, and I'm making medal in Olympics. Caribbean man, and my name is Katanga. And my name is Balagobin. My name is Pereira. Roche and Chicholin. The crossing river and the crossing road. Caribbean man, catching every banana load. Caribbean man, my name is Steve and I'm flying plane. Caribbean man, planting cocoa and planting cane. Caribbean man, walking dentists and clearing land. Caribbean man, I'm playing cello and beating pan. Caribbean man. A honeymooning couple was in a bedroom, packing up the whole in the middle of June. And all of a sudden, argument break out. Listen to the bridegroom, listen what he shout. And it makes you get on top as you wait it must go. And it tells you get on top. Don't make noise, shut your mouth. That's the only way it will work. Red again on top. Sing up, sing up. All right, red again on top. Tell me. Sing up, sing up. Red again on top. One time. Sing up, sing up. 2 times. Red again on top. 3 times. Sing up, sing up. I am a people behind the door. Somebody fall down, poop on the floor, and somebody shout out, you're squeezing me hard. And this time the lady, she telling the man, and she telling him, you get on top, that's the way it must go. I am your wife, now you know. And she telling him, you get on top. Don't make noise. His mother stay shut your mouth. Let her get on top. Alright. Let her get on top. You again. One time. Let her get on top. Let her get on top. Don't talk about the grunting and the breathing hard. Imagine me outside, mother going mad, quiet as a church mouse, listening to this thing. This time the lady, she starts to sing. And if you hear she said, both are we on top. That's the way it must be. And the husband say, yes, I agree. Oh, definitely. Both are we on top. Don't make noise, shut your mouth. That's the only way it will work. Both are get on top. Sing and sing and sing. Both are get on top. Both are we on top, we are you. Sing and sing and sing, all are we. Both are we on top. Sing and sing and sing. Now I ain't no people, ask anybody. But 2 of them on top, this I got to see. So down by the keyhole, man I put me eye. And what I saw me feel now, till I cry. was a man and his wife, and the two of them on top. And you see them in this funny pose. Feel this song. And the two of them, they sitting down on top of a suitcase. It's like a Guyana suitcase. They're trying. Them big one. You can put a car inside. What are we on top? Close the blasted thing. A lady came all the way from Philadelphia. She said, I come to hear one song. The song about the guy from San Francisco. So we can do it right now and move on. This is Brother Jones. 1, 2, 1, 2. Brother Jones, come to tongue and preaching brotherhood. Open up a temple in a jungle far away. Alright. And all the people follow. When he tell them jump, they jump. When he tell them bump, they bump. When he tell them dance, they dance. When he tell them scratch, they scratch. Ay, 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 ay. Brother Jones, living like a king in those them days. Ruling men and women. And the Yankee money coming in by aeroplane. Alright. And Brother Jones, then he tell them rise, rise. Then he tell them sleep, sleep. Then he tell them shake, shake. Then he tell them soar, soar.
Oh, yes, Brother Jones. Brother Jones. You know, we Caribbean people, we're the only people in the world who's party to politics, you know. That song, Brother Jones, is about Jonestown. And you see them partying, people they're partying. I think that concert was in Washington, D.C. I can't remember whether I was there or not, because, you know, I was a D.C. man. And we're the only people who party to politics. My students are always amazed by it. They're always amazed by it. Caribbean people. Brother Jones, when he tell them jump, they jump. Tell them swim, they swim. Jonestown, 45 years ago, 1978 November. 1978 November, Brother Jones. The trade wins. The trade wins. The trade wins. Dave Martins, our own Dave Martins, and the trade wins. Signature signature group coming out of Guyana. For a long time in Toronto, I noticed a lot of Toronto people in the house tonight. Good evening to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. As you know, we in Guyana, we say Canada. We bad, you know. You can't stop we in the Caribbean. You know, we don't say ginger ale in Guyana, we say Canada Dry. Oh Lord. Hey, the creativity of Guyanese and Caribbean people. It's what we have given to the world. The creative intellect and the creative imagination. Good evening to all of you. Please share the link we're on tonight. I noticed the DeFloremans are in the house from Washington, D.C., Maryland. You know, we don't say Maryland there, you know, and Virginia. We say we're from D.C. We assume that you're from Maryland or you're from Northern Virginia. Good evening to all the good people of Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. God spare life. We're going to be there in a couple of days for that conference in Guyana organized by Brother Rickford Burke. It's going to be down there in Washington, D.C. I'll be traveling there, God spare life, and hoping to catch up with family and friends. The majority of my American family, my mother is still in that area, several brothers and sisters there. My brother George, who's a fixture in the Guyanese community there. I noticed Sister Lynette Zephyr is here. She's an honorary DC girl. Been coming to DC, been going to DC now for how long? Oh Lord, since in the 1980s, Memorial Day weekend. The whole of the Guyanese, Buxtonian, New York side used to travel down to Washington, D.C. And it used to be the place to be until y'all people in Atlanta started the Atlanta Carnival and people start boycotting Washington and going to Atlanta. But we used to have a good time on Memorial Day weekend. Oh, wonderful times when our home was the headquarters. You go, you put down your bag where you're staying, and you come over to our place. And in fact, most people never used to put on the bag. They come straight there because that's where the action was. Memorial Day weekend. Good evening, Lynette. And you know, when Lynette and them girls come in the house, they take over the house, you know. When them girls take over the house, you live there, you can't go and counteract because they're in charge. They're in charge. You live in the house, you can't open your own pot because when them girls take over the kitchen, stay out of the kitchen. You can't stop we Guyanese. We bad like that. Good evening. Good evening, Washington, D.C. The DeFloremans, Dr. Desiree DeFlorement, who taught for years at Morgan State University, an education specialist, a well-known family. They used to have a group called Guyade. They used to keep the biggest Mother's Day party in Washington, D.C. They used to have a big one in New York, too. But Sister DeFlorement and others, our own indigenous thing. You know, wherever Caribbean people go, we took our culture with us. We took our culture with us. That's one thing. We don't walk without our culture. And there are about 25, 30 carnivals across the Caribbean right now. You know, when I lived in Los Angeles 20 years ago, I taught there. I taught in California for 3 years, and that was 20 odd years ago. And they were just starting the LA Carnival. And I remember it was in a little yard, and the floats would circle the yard, circle the yard, because you had about 5 or 6 floats. I understand it's big there now. Big there now. In Washington, D.C. started out as Summer in the Park, and then it moved to the D.C. Carnival, and you have Baltimore Carnival, and I once went up to one up there in Washington State. Wherever we go, we walk with our culture, because the culture is the identity. That's what we give to the world. Good evening to all of you. All of you are joining us from out in the Caribbean, our Caribbean. Those of you out there in London, the United Kingdom, out there in France, the Nottingham Carnival, big carnival, started by, some West Indian women. They started a Nottingham Carnival way back. Of course, the mother of all diaspora carnivals is the one that just finished there in New York, Brooklyn Carnival. Good evening to all of you. So next week, the conference in Guyana in Washington, D.C. And I understand quite a lot of people are coming up from Guyana. And I know people there in Washington, D.C., Maryland are coming up. Brother Kidaki, I understand, is coming up for that conference. And some others, some members of the PNC, I think AFC, some independent people are going to be there. I'll be there. I think I'm presenting on the panel on discrimination and so forth. So it's important. It's important that we do the conference. And already the conference has been a success. It has been a success because we got the government to pay attention to it. Ultimately, when we do these things, we are trying to get the attention of the government. Dictatorships like to behave invincible. That is, they don't care. This conference, organized by Brother Rickford Bork and others, is already a success because we got the attention of the government to the point where they dispatched the president to go up to Washington, D.C. And we know what happened. He went up there, he had a lot of meetings. Of course, he's the head of state. He has the embassy there and so on, and they were able to organize meetings and so on. And as we say, in some of the meetings, they're proper peppy. And they don't like, bullies don't like to say they get pepper. Went back to Guyana and said, oh, they didn't pepper me. They didn't raise these issues. And then Hakeem Jeffries put out a statement saying what they raised. So the conference is already a success in the sense that it has caught the attention of the government, and it got the government to do something that it would not normally do. And those of us who are political scientists, whatever that means, but those of us who are political scientists, we know that the definition of power is the ability to get people to do things they would not voluntarily do. If If Fanali had his way, he wouldn't come up to Washington. But the conference that we put on made him come up. What that means is that that conference represents power. Again, let me repeat the political science definition of power. The ability to get people to do things that they would not voluntarily or ordinarily do. You're hustling to get home after work. You would rather not stop at the traffic light. I figure if it were not for the traffic light, I would be home from campus in 20, 25 minutes. It takes me at this time of the afternoon about 35, 40 minutes to get up here. But when the traffic light comes on, we have to stop. I would rather not stop. We would rather not stop. But something called the government has the power to make us stop by putting those traffic lights. They're making us do things that we would not voluntarily do. Some of you just run the traffic light. But when you run the traffic light, you run the risk of being punished. So when we got the dictatorship in Guyana, because Rickford Burke said he's assembling a big team and we're going to Washington to talk to the Americans as a way of rebuking the government in Guyana. And the government in Guyana, although we are not talking to them directly, they responded. First of all, Jack Dio going to blackmail anybody who participates. But that's Jack Dio. That's Jack Dio. You run off at his mouth and sometimes he talks sense. Sometimes he don't talk sense. But he wields a lot of power. So whether he talks sense or he don't talk sense, we got to take him seriously because he wields power. So if he say he don't talk sense, he run off at his mouth. He has the institutional capacity. He has the institutional power to turn his mouth running into policy. So we already win the victory because the president came up, he made his rounds, and next week we're going to make our rounds. Here is why that conference is important. Regime change. Regime change of 2020. By now, you all should understand how that regime change worked. Guyana had reached a defining moment in its history. It discovered black gold, plenty of it. All them mercenaries and who come down looking for El Dorado 300, 400 years ago. We finally found the real El Dorado, black gold. They were looking for the brown gold, and they got some of it. But the real El Dorado is the isle that we found the other day. And once we found El Dorado, it meant that everything else changes. That's just like back then when the technological advance that discovered the cotton gin and the sugar mill, everything in the world changed. Africans were brought against their will to the New World. The European marauders all over the world. The world changed. We moved from a feudal state to a capitalist state of affairs in the world. And so now we find black gold. Everything changed. We were no longer a little dot somewhere on the northern tip of South America who nobody cared about. Once we found that oil, the world powers descended on Guyana. They all came out of the woodworks. They were busy in the Middle East and all over the place. And once we found oil, they turned their attention to us. And they began to make their play. The big question was not who would own the oil. Guyana had no capacity to exercise sovereignty over its oil. We don't. Let's not fool ourselves. We do not have the capacity to exercise sovereignty over our oil. Those who have the power, the United States through its multinational corporation, that's Exxon, and the British through Hess and all those other companies, the Europeans, they took sovereignty over our oil. And when you start with sovereignty over oil, by logic, you move to sovereignty over the country. Our sovereignty, our control of our sovereignty was always shaky, but at least we had some sovereignty. And by sovereignty, of course, we mean control. At least we control our politics to some extent. But we can't control the oil. So sovereignty over our oil was out of our hands, although the oil is found in our territory. And when America and the Europeans moved in and took over control, exercising sovereignty over oil, by logic, they moved from sovereignty over oil to sovereignty over everything else, including the election that was coming up. To exercise the sovereignty over the oil, they need sovereignty over the politics and the governance. And the way you do it is not like in the old days, colonial days. You go in, you take over the government. And even recently, I mean, I'm wrong to say that it happened in colonial days. The Americans and British and others were moving in to countries just the other day and take control. But there are other ways of taking control other than invading a country. You take control over the politics and the governance by determining who govern and take control of them. And so they came in and they surveyed. And when you come into a country, you don't first go to the government, you go to the opposition. Because the opposition wants to get into government. And it's easy to swing up their heads. The other thing, if you're a foreign country, you look for are those who you think are less nationalistic and more individualistic. What do I mean by that? There are politicians who are into politics not in the interest of the nation, but in the interest of their social group, their political party, and their friends. And there are some politicians who are into politics ultimately in the interest of the country. That's what I mean by nationalists. So if you're a foreign actor, you look into those forces that you can maneuver. So you're looking for those who are not nationalistic or as nationalistic as others. And when you examine Guyana, the PPP, when compared with the PNC and WPA and the old political forces, and in our post-colonial history, the forces in the country can be lined up with, among those three major parties when you look at our political history from the 1960s to the 1990s. The PNC, of course, Africans, generally the Africans. PPP, the Indians. The WPA, the radical forces, some Indians, some Africans. But, you know, the radical Africans and radical Indians lined up behind the radical party. So those three parties generally give us a sense of how our political population evolved over time. And when you look at those three political parties, you look at their history, the PPP has been the least nationalistic. The PPP was first concerned with communism and the Communist International, and they took directions from the Communist International. They were more loyal to the Communist International than loyal to the national sentiments of Guyana. When you look at the position they took on Caribbean integration, less of a loyalty to the Caribbean nation. They kept Guyana out of the integration. They kept Guyana out of the federation. They were lukewarm to the early CARICOM. And I would argue they're still lukewarm to CARICOM. They saw CARICOM as a black people club. And the PPP split. After the Burnham-Jagan split in 55, there was another split in 56. When Sidney King, Martin Carter, and others, Rory Westmos, left. And they left on the question of Caribbean integration. They wanted Guyana to be part of the Federation. And Jagan didn't want. And so Sidney King and others broke with the PPP in a second split. So the PPP had no fidelity to Caribbean nationalism, no fidelity to Guyana nationalism. They were more concerned with the Communist International. They were more concerned with the narrow interest of East Indians as opposed to the larger interest. And they didn't take Guyana into the Federation because they felt their East Indian supporters would become a minority, whereas in Guyana they were a majority. That was why they didn't take Guyana into the Federation. So the PPP, of all the other two parties, WPA and the PNC was pro-CARICOM. The WPA was pro-CARICOM, still is. Pro-Caribbean. Neither of the two were in the Communist International. They were Marxist party. The PNC even called itself Marxist-Leninist. The WPA said they were independent Marxists. But they were not wedged. They were not wedded, sorry, to the Communist International. The WPA belonged to the Socialist International, not the Communist International. So the WPA and the PNC demonstrated a more commitment to a nationalist position. If you are the Americans and the British and you're coming in and you want to exercise sovereignty over the oil by influencing who govern, you look around and you're looking for the group that is the least nationalistic. So when I am sure when they looked at the three groups, they said the PPP. Because the Americans were not just, and British were not just concerned about the oil, they were concerned about Venezuela. I mean, just today, the Americans gave entry to America. 463,000 Venezuelans were given freedom to live and work in America. Haitians are being turned back. Venezuelans, by their numbers, are being taken in. Why? Because if you're America, you have an interest in weakening Venezuelan government. And one of the ways you weaken is you take in their nationals into your country. So the Americans were also looking at Venezuela. Who is more likely to allow their country to be used to undermine Venezuela? You want the least nationalists. And then you, the Americans, you look around, the PPP is your candidate. They're least nationalistic. They're in the opposition. So they really want power. And the third thing is that the PPP believe that God put them to run Guyana. So the Guyanese version, the PPP version of Manifest Destiny. They feel that the PNC cannot govern. And by extension, you must mean that the PNC supporters cannot govern. You know, after the end of slavery in America, they said Black people could not exist within a state of freedom. And I think that is part of the ideology of some people in the PPP. They honestly feel that Black people cannot exist in a state of freedom, and you have to govern them. I've heard PPP leaders say Indian people support the PPP not because they're Indian. They support the PPP because the PPP is a good party. But Black people support the PNC not because the PNC is a good party. Black people support the PNC through race. So they're saying that Black people are less rational. Indian people are supporting the PPP not because the PPP is an Indian party, but because Indian people are rational to see that the PPP is a good party, and Black people are not as rational. So they support the PNC irrationally, based on race. And so there are elements in the PPP who subscribe to the Manifest Destiny, that for a convergence of reasons, the PPP is the only party to govern. More evidence? Jack Dio says, if you want, join us. We're not joining with nobody. If you want to participate, join us. One Guyana is PPP supporters and hangers on from the other ethnic groups. That's the one Guyana. Because as Joel Bagwandin said the other night, we share nothing in Guyana. We don't have shared values. We don't have shared vision. So how can we have a one Guyana of all of us when we don't share anything? So obviously one Guyana is about one PPP with hangers on from the other ethnic groups. So if you are the Americans and the British and the Europeans, and you come after oil is found, and you look to who is more pliable, you can go with the PPP. And that's exactly what they did. And so what you do is you begin to what? Use the system to undermine the other parties that were in the coalition. So you're not overthrowing them directly. You're overthrowing them indirectly by undermining them, using the system to undermine them. So the PPP was able to raise tens of millions of dollars, and they paid high-class lobbyists to lobby the American government, and they were very clever. They didn't just lobby the federal government, they lobby the Congress. And in lobbying Congress, you're lobbying the states. And they were able to sell those people a narrative that was easily bought. You see, Americans are preoccupied with democracy. You ask them what it means most of the time, and democracy means what the person says it means. And the PPP knew that. And so the PPP sold the coalition as anti-democratic. The coalition, in the meantime, had no inkling what was happening around them. And this is where I fall them. Eh? This is where I fall them. You do not have government and you don't understand. But anyhow, I've made that point that the coalition did not understand its historical significance. It was the closest that we came to power sharing. The UFPNC government of 64 was a coalition of two parties. The coalition of 2015 to 2020 was a coalition of at least three significant parties and some other small groups. It brought together several forces in this society. But the people who were in the leadership had no inkling of the significance of what they were doing. They had no inkling of the historical forces that brought them to power. You see, you're brought to power not just by the voters. There are historical forces that come together to make a shift in the system. When people were saying it was impossible to remove the PPP, all of a sudden it becomes possible. And the PPP were beaten in 2011 and 2015. But again, I said the coalition had no understanding of the historical forces that gathered to bring it to power. So when it got the power, it just treated the power like the power of any party that come to power. It didn't realize that it had the task of doing in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, what other governments can take 20 years to do. It was an unusual government, almost coming to power by a fluke, but it was more than a fluke. And so there was not time to waste. You had to make fundamental changes. The Grenadians were in power for 4 years. The Grenadian Revolution, before they toppled themselves, and the Americans helped to topple them. In those 4 years, those people wiped out illiteracy from Grenada. In 4 years, they transformed the Grenadian economy into one of the fastest growing economy at that time. They brought in new institutions, people's institutions. When I visit Grenada to this day, they still have women's groups. Women are getting together and making orange juice, making nutmeg this, all that happened in 4 years of the revolution. And between 2015 2020, it was a revolutionary period. Only that the coalition did not recognize that what occurred in 2011, 2015 was a revolution. It was a revolution at the ballot box. But they had no insight, and they were not prepared to listen to those of us who had experience with revolution. We knew it was a revolution, but we were sidelined. So because they had no understanding of their significance, while the PPP was plotting with external forces to overthrow them, they had no idea. And it made it easy for regime change. Regime change thrives when the regime you're trying to remove is not conscious of what's happening. You see how long Maduro, they have not removed Maduro because Maduro is conscious that that's what they're doing to him. And so he fights back. Our coalition couldn't fight back because it had no consciousness of its own significance and what others were doing to overthrow it. And so what the coalition, what the PPP did, along with external forces, is use the very system in an undemocratic way. They knew the voters list was padded, and they undermined attempts to change the voters list. They went through the very court system. It's a very sophisticated way of overthrowing a government. You use the weaknesses. They knew the court system. They knew the courts in Guyana were conservative. And the courts of Guyana would acquiesce towards a lot of the plans. And the court ended up playing a major role in the regime change. I'm not saying the court consciously helped to change the regime, but the regime changers knew. They knew the weaknesses of the court system, and they used it. The PPP knew that all you needed to do at GCOM was to swing the GCOM chair. And they used all kinds of tactics until they broke that lady. Once you capture GCOM, you capture the court system, then you are riding pretty. And then while the coalition is busy going through the motions of governing, the people are lining up the international forces, because international forces are important. When the OAS and CARICOM and the EU and the Commonwealth, when those forces join together to come against a small government, you goose cook, because they're bringing with them all the forces at their disposal. The OAS is coming with the power of America and Canada and Brazil. All the big countries in the Americas are there. When the Commonwealth speak, you have the power of England behind it. And so all of those forces were given the Kool-Aid to drink, and they drank it well. And when the coalition realized it was being pushed out, and it tried to fight back, what did they do? They brought the power of the American state in the person of the Secretary of State. When the Secretary of State called the Guyana head of state, it's not a man calling a man. It's the power of the greatest country on earth, the greatest military might, one of the great economically strong countries. When the Secretary of State calls the Guyana head of state, it is the power of the greatest country in the world calling the leader of one of the small and least influential country in the world. There's no match there. So when the coalition decided that it was going to push back, they employ the might of the American state. The rest is history. The rest is history. You all can shout, because some of you are still shouting that the coalition win the election. It matters not. The election was not determined by who win or who lose. Because if the elections were determined by that, the coalition might have been in power because the coalition was able to prove that the elections were interfered with. At least they proved that. Because they get the box to open. I think unconstitutionally, they opened the boxes unconstitutionally, but at least they opened them. And they were able to show that there were tainted votes in the box. The PPP is yet to prove its case. It set up a commission in its own image, so that commission don't count. The court, it has not proven its case in court. It has not proven its case if Maji come. Because the results were never taken to the commissioners to sign off on, as they did in 2011 when Vincent Alexander catch the PPP attempting to steal the election. So the PPP case was not signed off on by GCOM nor the court. The PPP's justification that it won, it is because the international community says so. So, when the elections were over, they were put in power. And the international community, after 1 year, realized the monster that they created. The Americans said the elections were disputed and the government was installed. It meant, therefore, that having secured its own interests, the Americans are saying our interest is intact, but the price that you Guyanese have to pay to secure our interests is that you all have a regime that was installed. Our interest is taken care of, but you all get an installed regime. I am arguing, therefore, that the Americans and the Europeans and CARICOM and all the others have a moral and political right to help to correct the wrong that they heaped upon Guyana. I am arguing there's a way for the Americans to protect their interests without regime change. You do regime change in 2020, I'm arguing that you don't have to do regime change anymore. I am staunchly opposed to regime change in 2020. I'm opposed to it in 2025. I do not want to be part of any government as a result of regime change. So I I am not advocating for Americans to change the regime. What I'm advocating for the Americans to do is that they must clean up the mess that they created with regime change in 2020. And if cleaning up that mess leads to a government change, not regime change, a government change, I am okay with that. I am okay with that. And so that's why we are going to Washington. Taking our case to the Americans, not to beg for regime change, but to educate the Americans about the consequences of what they did in 2020. So that's why it's important with the conference coming up. And the Guyana government knows that. They know that we are going to Washington to speak to people who are not ignorant about race. Perhaps the most racialized society in the world is America. So they understand race. While Guyanese will talk foolishness that we don't have a race problem, the Americans know better. They're literate about race. They are literate about race. And the PPP knows that. They don't want us. Look, you all look at all the things. Corruption, the PPP would jump around a little bit. Rigging election, they're going to jump around a little bit. You just tell them that their policies are racial and they get ignorant because they know that you are getting very close to the truth. The PPP cannot help itself. It cannot help itself. It's a party that over the years was able to cover its racial outlook with ideology, calling itself communist. But once that communism tag was removed, once that mask was removed, and you now get the greedy so-called capitalists, the racial mask is removed. The racial mask is removed. I've said on this program, the PNC got its problem with race, but I think they've done a far more superior job at managing race. In fact, I think the PNC has gone the other way. They ignore race to their peril. They ignore race to their peril. So if the PNC got a weakness on race, it's not in being racial in their policies or racist in their policies. It's being stupidly non-racist. No, sorry, non-racial, not non-racist. They have a right to be non-racist. If the PNC, you can charge them for anything, is to being stupidly non-racial, not for being racial. The PPP, on the other hand, they've always embraced race as a mobilization tool. And so we are going to Washington to internationalize the case against a racial dictatorship in Guyana. Because that's what the PPP is. It's a racial dictatorship. A racial dictatorship that thrives on racist policies. Some of the policies are racist in intent, and those that are not racist in intent, they have racist outcomes. Look at the roads. Look at how Jagdeo tried to answer that question. He couldn't answer it. If you are a racially fair government, you would always be conscious when you are tilting to one side. Because if you're truly fair in terms of race, you become sensitive. You cussing on the road, and the pastor passing. Oh! And you stop in mid-sentence. We used to do that a lot in Buxton when choir passing. You're up on the street corner, you're playing card, by carry you. Oh, brother, you see, Jambo. Right? Because you're conscious that you ought not to be doing that. If the PPP were conscious that you ought not to be unfair to other races, somebody would have noticed that you're doing 30-something road in Bushlat and Seminole in the African communities. And somebody would have said, no, God, you can't do that. But that consciousness is not in the leadership. It's not in the leadership. And so we go to Washington to make our case openly. Not to tell the Americans we want you to go and regime change in Guyana, but to say to the Americans that you have done Guyana a grievous wrong. That in pursuit of your own interests, you have screwed up Guyana. And there must be a way for Washington to look after their own interests without messing up the interests of one section of the Guyanese community. So, sisters and brothers, we are on a mission. We are on a mission. And that mission is to clean up the mess of 2020 and to open the door for a real democratic Guyana. Not a democratic Guyana that is based on democratic rhetoric, but a democratic Guyana that is based on the democratization of the institutions of our country. The democratization of the governance of our country. That is the significance of what Rickford Burke has organized in the coming days. So those of you all who think that we're going there to get the Americans to go and overthrow the PPP, oh no, that's not what we are going there for. We are going there to lay our case to the Americans to say that you have done wrong in 2020 and you have to correct that wrong. And that is part of the job that we have before us. Let us not fool ourselves. The PPP will not come to the table and change that voters list because we tell them to do it. They're not going to do that. They will have to be pushed to the table. And they will have to be pushed to the table by a convergence of forces the force of the people to continue protesting and raising the issues, by the conscience of their benefactors in North America and Europe and the Caribbean, recognizing what they have done and contributing towards straightening the crooked roads. So it's another stop sign in our struggle. We have to be real. We have to be real. We have to be real and not fool ourselves. So we're going there tomorrow. Next week, I mean. And we're going to make our case. As usual, I hope you've clarified a lot tonight. I hope you've clarified a lot tonight and make it clear. Because I know this regime change thing is a little bit complex. It's a little bit complex. But I know we're smart enough to ultimately understand what's happening. We're winning. As I said, we've already won with this conference because we forced them out of their bunkers to come out, and then they come out and they lie. Hakeem Jeffries know they lie. His comrades and colleagues know that they lie. Who forced them to lie? We forced them to lie. And in lying, they've weakened their own regime. They've weakened their own regime. Tomorrow night we come again. Brother Rick Ford should have been on tonight, but he got delayed. His flight got delayed, so he's not able to come on tonight. Hopefully tomorrow night we're going to be able to get him on. So until tomorrow night, stay strong. Get vexed, but stay strong. Stay strong. Victory is coming. Victory is coming. Stay strong. Victory is coming.